Good evening, everybody. Nice to have all of you here with us. I'm Mohammed Ali, and I'll be your host for this evening. Welcome to the Sojourners to Settlers Tamils in Southeast Asia and Singapore webinar. This is a series. This series is brought to you by the Indian Heritage Centre Singapore with the generous support of the Tamil Language Learning and Promotion Committee, Tamil Language Council, and Yuva Bharati International School. In December 2019, the Indian Heritage Centre and the Institute of Policy Studies co-published and launched Sojourners to Settlers, Tamils in Southeast Asia and Singapore, a seminal two-volume publication on Tamil diasporas in Southeast Asia and Singapore. Leading up to the launch of the Tamil version of this publication in April 2021, this webinar presents the research of four authors featured in the publication, including Professor John Miksic, Dr. Todson Sasha, Professor Sunil Amrit, and Ms. K. Kanagalata. To complement these four sessions in the series, a distinguished guest speaker, Dr. John Guy of the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, will also present perspectives on pre-modern Tamil trading networks with Southern China. The series is moderated by Mr. Arun Mahirnan, co-editor of the publication. This evening, we are delighted to have all of you to join us in the Sojourners to Settlers webinar in this series featuring Dr. John Guy of the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. He will be joined by Mr. Arun Mahirnan as moderator for this session. Arun, as most of you know, is no stranger at all. He has been a committed champion of research and inquiry into Singapore's Tamil heritage. Most recently, he mooted and steered the Tamil Digital Heritage Project, a community-driven project aimed at creating a digital collection of Singapore's Tamil literary and performance works. Arun is Special Research Advisor at the Institute of Policy Studies, Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy, National University of Singapore. He's also Director, Center for Singapore Tamil Culture, a voluntary organization to promote interculturalism. Publications that he has edited include Sojourners to Settlers, Tamils in Southeast Asia and Singapore, as well as Singapore Chronicles, a 50-volume book series commemorating Singapore's 50th anniversary. Arun, it's my pleasure now to invite you to introduce this evening's session and the speaker.
Thank you for your kind words, Ali. It is a great pleasure for me to be here once again, together with my co-moderator, Nalina Gopal, who also helped me edit the book on which this webinar series is based. The title of our webinar is Nagapattinam to Guangzhou, Tracing Tamil Merchants in Historical Maritime Asia. Nagapattinam is a name that would be familiar to most Tamils who have some knowledge of Tamil history, as it was a leading port for centuries on the eastern coast of Tamil country. They would also likely know about Kedah in today's Malaysia, or Aceh in Indonesia, and a few other places in Southeast Asia, as places that form a part of the history of Tamils in this region. However, very few would have heard of the name of Guangzhou in connection with ancient Tamil trade. That Tamil traders went as far as this city in southern China and did a roaring trade with that great country is little known among many who are aware of Tamil history. Guangzhou was a leading center of foreign traders in China between 11th and 14th centuries. It was then popularly known as Zaiton. According to history, it was visited by both Marco Polo and Ibn Battuta. Both of these famous travelers praised it as one of the most prosperous and glorious cities in the world. Guangzhou was already a cosmopolitan city with Buddhist and Hindu temples, yes, Hindu temples, Islamic mosques, and Christian churches. Yet, we seldom hear of the exploits of the Tamil traders in China. This obscure subject is the focus of the discussion today. I must point out that our volume on Tamils in Southeast Asia did not include a chapter on this fascinating story, not because it was outside Southeast Asia, as the history of Southeast Asia cannot be told without China. It was because we could not get the leading author on the subject to contribute to our book due to his prior commitments. To make up for the loss, today we have him with us, and I have great pleasure and honor to present to you Dr. John Guy. He is speaking to us from New York in the early hours of this November morning. Dr. John Guy is the Florence and Herbert Irving Curator of the Arts of South and Southeast Asia at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. He had also served as Senior Curator of South Asian Art at the Victoria and Albert Museum in London. The Met and the V&A are among the best museums in the world, and he has been a key player in both. He is an elected fellow of the Society of Antiquaries in London and also of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. He has worked on a number of archaeological excavations, including maritime sites, and served as an advisor to UNESCO on historical sites in Southeast Asia. He has curated numerous international art exhibitions and published widely in both refereed journals and collected volumes. Now, his publication list is too long to cite in full here, so I would just highlight a few to show his range of interests and expertise. Oriental trade ceramics in Southeast Asia, 9th to 16th centuries. Southeast Asia and China, art, commerce, and interaction. Then there was this book, Arts of India, 1550 to 1900. Indian textiles in the East, Indian temple sculpture, and finally, Interwoven Globe, the worldwide textile trade, 1500 to 1800. As you can see, we are in the hands of a veteran historian, curator, and storyteller. Now, I hand you over to Dr. John Guy.
So, good evening, Singapore. Thank you for the invitation from the Indian Heritage Centre to speak in this series on the Tamil diaspora in association with the exhibition Sojourners to Settlers, Coromandel Coast to the Straits. It's a great pleasure to be joining this series and to speak this evening on a specific topic to do with Indo-Sino-Indian relations. I want to preface my remarks by making a few words of acknowledgement to my mentor in the field of early Southeast Asian history, and that is Professor Wong Dong-Wu, who's held many prestigious positions, most recently as the founding director of the Asian Research Institute in Singapore, who I understand has just celebrated his 90th birthday. So hearty congratulations to Professor Wong. His pioneering study, the Nanhai Trade, proved to be a seminal work for many of us in the early study of Asia and the role of the importance of the waters and maritime intersections, which linked the Nanhai, the South China Sea, to the Indian Ocean world, and hence the whole networks which bridged between the Mediterranean, Red Sea, right through to East Asia. Tonight I'm speaking on the topic of Nagapattinam to Chuangzhou, tracing Tamil merchants in historical maritime Asia. This lecture presents an overview of the presence of Tamil mariners and entrepreneurs in historic maritime Asia, a vista spanning from the early centuries Common Era to the close of the 13th century. Two regions, southeastern India and southeastern China, were linked throughout much of this period, and at times their mutual prosperity was interdependent. The role of the port cities and the waters that occupy the spaces in between represented a dynamic network along which flowed not only goods, but also people, images, ideas, and religions. The coastal port city of Nagapattinam in Tamil Nadu served the Chola dynasty as their principal international port, and in southern China, Chuangzhou in Fujian fulfilled the same role for the Mongol rulers of Yuan China. They were linked by a long history of maritime exchange, served by an international host of traders, Malays, Persians, Arabs, and most especially Tamils of southern India. The presence of Tamil-speaking merchants is attested from early in the first millennium, and their presence in maritime Asia is witnessed both archaeologically and through inscriptions. They're present at sites spanning from the Red Sea to insular Southeast Asia to southern China. Southeast Asia was especially favored as the Savana Bhumi, Savana Dweepa of early Indian sources, the lands and islands of gold. And India's hunger for gold was undoubtedly a significant factor in these early ventures. Today, I'll explore the role of these Tamil merchants in this commercial quest and the legacy their presence left in the region, from Brahmins who served in positions of ritual and political influence at the courts of the emerging Hindu Buddhist states, to the traders who built their places of worship in peninsular Southeast Asia and in the great mercantile entrepôts of South China, in Guangdong, Canton, and in Chuangzhou and Fujian. Briefly, this map gives you a sense of the regions we're spanning to be addressed from the southeastern coasts of India, the southern Coromandel, south of Mahabalipuram, marked on this map, Nagapattinam, at the estuary of the Kaveri River, which serves from Tanjore district out to the coast. That hinterland was a key region for resources, materials, trade goods, and particularly people. And we know that the trading communities, the merchant guilds of these regions operated out of Nagapattinam in their ventures to Southeast Asia and on to South China. The equatorial regions of Southeast Asia, the Malay Straits of the Malay Peninsula, Sumatra, the peninsula of southern Thailand, these all represent key regions on the map and represent the stepping off point for journeying up the coast of Vietnam to the ports of southern China, which in the early centuries, first millennium, were really outpost towns, Wild West regions, almost beyond the rule of central control in China, but were gradually in the course of that first century absorbed into China proper and brought under administrative control. So it is these regions which are interconnected, and I'll be discussing this evening. On the upper right, on the flank of southern China, Chuangzhou is more or less, is unfortunately not marked on this map, further up the coast. So these maritime routes were widely navigated from a very early period, once the command of the monsoons had been achieved. Now it's widely assumed, and it's significant in many ways, that the spread of knowledge of these maritime routes came about through the role of Buddhist pilgrims. And it's certainly true that much of what we know today, some of the best, most detailed descriptions of journeys from point A to point B to point C, come from the annals from India, from Fasian from 5th century, Ronzang, Yijing in the 7th century, and others. But the reality, of course, is that these monks traveled on merchant ships. And so a pre-existing maritime network was clearly in place. They were merely passengers, if you like, on a well-established trading system operated by a range of nationalities and many actors of many different cultures involved in this maritime network, of which Tamil saw a major player, Tamil Hindus, also Tamil increasingly from the coastal regions, Tamil Muslims, together with West Asian Muslims, Malays, and so on. We have the evidence for maritime activity across the Bay of Bengal, the most immediate link between the Indian subcontinent and Southeast Asia is witnessed in the early centuries of the Common Era. We have beginnings of numismatics appearing under the Satavahanas of Andhra Pradesh, southeastern coastal India, issuing coins in which ships are depicted, multi-mast ocean vessels, which would have conducted commerce across the Bay of Bengal and Inland Sea to the Malay Peninsula. And in the course of this evening's presentation, we'll see witness exactly what impact they had. Also, clay seals, which were undoubtedly associated with merchant products and consigning of goods. We knew that the Tamils were widely scattered, and one of the earliest artifacts to witness this are inscribed ceramics. These are not what I'd call trade ceramics. These are utility wares, for the most part, earthenwares, largely found in very small quantities, inscribed in Tamil, early Brahmi Tamil script, which would suggest these were the personal property of expatriate Tamils. On the upper two images on the left, a fragment from Qasr el-Qadim in the Red Sea, the other from Oman, and the one below from the Thai Peninsula. And others have also been found in Bali. So there's a very wide distribution of these types of inscribed ceramics, clearly witnessing the presence of Tamil-speaking peoples. The international trade network, known to many of you, of course, included, had an extremely wide reach. The trading chain, if you like, this interconnectivities that extended, that allowed numerous Roman coins from the 2nd, 3rd century to be discovered in Thailand and in Mekong Delta and so on, clear indications of the extent of these networks. It's well known that the largest hoards of Roman numismatics found outside Europe have been found in India, and bear witness to this Indo-Roman trade that was conducted through the Red Sea, particularly in the 1st to 3rd centuries AD. Seals, intaglio seals, all recovered from Hokkyo, the important trading center in the Mekong Delta, and one of the many stopping off points for the long-distance trading system that linked India to China. We see the presence of Indians, or people with Indian connections or of Indian descent, Indian luxury goods appearing in Southeast Asia very early. On the left, a ivory comb recovered from a site, Chansen near Lopburi, central Thailand, clearly having Andhra Pradesh associations, auspicious symbols, and so on. The iconography looks largely Buddhist, but not exclusively. Much of the iconographic language in the early periods was shared across sectarian lines. The Gaja Lakshmi became so as an embodiment of Hinduism, and auspiciousness also was shared, of course, by the early Buddhists. We have a merchant seal, a spectacular object, which we have 2 or 3 surviving impressions, presumably made from a metal matrix imported from India. This would seem, it's got the boxed Brahmi inscription, the Trishula, the forward view Garuda, has close Gupta associations. It has a proper name embedded in the subsidiary inscription, indicating that this was certainly the property seal of an Indian merchant operating in mainland Southeast Asia, or one of his direct descendants. The China connection also begins very early. There are references to Indian emissaries coming to China very early, from the late Han period onwards. And then we have this extraordinarily hand scroll, which belongs to the 6th century, and which here we see it in an 11th century copy. All of the emissaries are associated with kingdoms connected through the Silk Route, through Central Asia, West Asian, Iranian, Sogdian, and other Turkoman connected emissaries. However, one only, and I show the detail above, is an emissary from Lankasuka, who is reasonably securely identified with the area around Nakhon Si Thammarat on the Thai Peninsula. And you can see his mode of dress. He's the only one who's wearing a simple lungi and shawl scarf. We see him here representing clearly what to the Chinese of the Liang dynasty in the 6th century was an important trading connection for the Chinese. The maritime activity is well documented in Jain and Buddhist sources, particularly, less so in Hindu ones. And I show you on the left the famous ship seen from Ajanta Cave 2, mid-5th century. It in fact tells one of the Avadana stories, the story of Bana, the pious sandalwood merchant who built a great sandalwood meditation hut for the Buddha with his wealth, show to him braving the passages and the dangers inherent in maritime trade. And around this time, we see the emergence of Bodhisattva cults, where the Avalokiteshvara becomes an important protector against the perils of travel. This underscores the importance of the mercantile trading communities to Buddhism as major patrons and supporters of Buddhism financially as well as devotionally. And we see two scenes. On the lower left, the scene from Kankiri Caves, in which the Bodhisattva is intervening, saving distressed mariners, and a manuscript version from Nepal, probably from the 11th century, with the same subject. The Buddha here is often identified as one of the past Buddhas, Dipankara, who became increasingly to be associated with mariners and maritime activity and the protection of those abroad traveling across the seas. And some of the most important early sculptures we have from Southeast Asia, this sandstone Buddha on the left, arguably the earliest found in mainland Southeast Asia, in peninsular Thailand, and very probably an import from Andhra, may well have been understood as the Dipankara past Buddha. The bronze, extraordinary, almost life-size bronze on the right, now in Jakarta, but discovered in the early 20th century in Sulawesi, I mean, a remote place by any measure, but clearly important for maritime purposes. There are networks which reach back. These objects, of course, bear witness to much of this history, which is otherwise obscure to us. We have this extraordinary inscription from Malang in East Java, mid-8th century, which gives us an important insight into image making in the region. It tells us that this temple was built by King Gajayana, and an image of Agastya in stone was installed to replace a sandalwood image, which had perished or deteriorated, quote, made by our ancestors. So this whole process of when we see the emergence of very sophisticated stone sculptural imagery in Southeast Asia and in India, seemingly coming out of nowhere, but very sophisticated and in its resolution of all the aesthetic issues, it's undoubtedly because there was a long lineage evolution of image making in perishable materials that preceded it that no longer survive. And this inscription, of course, signals that beautifully. Looking then for the tunnels in Southeast Asia before they found their way into China as best we can tell. This is some of the regions I'll point out to you here. We'll be focusing on Kutai on the eastern borders of Kalimantan, West Java, southern Sumatra, Palembang, north to Aceh and Lembah Bujang Valley in Kedah, up to the Isthmus of Kra, to Wat Klongtong, Takuapa. These are the key points of which we have clear evidence of important Indian, particularly specifically Tamil contacts. If you look at a map of early Southeast Asia, if you plot this distribution of Sanskrit inscriptions almost universally written in a southern Indian script, what we call Southern Brahmi today, used to be called Grantha script. It is very clear that the Indic traditions, as they arrived in Southeast Asia in the early centuries Common Era, were emanating from a southern Indian context, and the scripts bear witness to this very, very clearly. If you also look at the distribution of the inscriptions, you'll find that they're almost invariably located at points at which river systems connect the coast to the hinterlands. And this, of course, is a key to the trading system, which were drawing forest products, alluvial gold and other materials from the interior of these islands down to the coasts, where they could be linked into the international trading systems and fuel the trade that was operating between India and China. The locations are very, very revealing in terms of where these inscriptions occur. One of the important ones, the earliest ones we have is from just near Phuket, or near Krabi, actually in the Thai Peninsula. It's a small goldsmith's stone. It's inscribed with the name of the goldsmith in Tamil, and it's a Tamilian name, 3rd, 4th century in date, and bears witness to not only the sourcing of gold in Southeast Asia, to which Savannah Bhumi, Savannah-Vipa in Indian sources bear very clear witness, but also to sending skilled artisans who process the gold in the region itself. That tradition, of course, continues right through into later periods. I'll show you a 1900s photograph. The man in the center suggests of Tamilian descent, with Malay, Indonesian colleagues working in a goldsmithing facility in South Sumatra. Many instances of the tools of gold working recovered from Java, and including the two in the upper left, which came from one of the Java Sea shipwrecks, 10th, 11th century. Gold objects, of course, rarely survive in any great quantities. They're so susceptible to recycling, to being melted down and repurposed. That's why we have so little ancient gold artifacts surviving from India, particularly. It all went back into the melting pot. Grandmother's jewelry recycled for granddaughter's dowry, etc., etc. The inscriptions plot the map, as I said earlier. I begin here with the Vo Khan inscription from Nha Trang in Vietnam, in a rather coarse Sanskrit. Vo Khan will be located at a river estuary. The entire Vietnamese coast is spotted with these small entrepot centers. The Yupa inscriptions from Kalimantan, very important, 7 stones, dated 4th, early 5th century, which record Vedic ritual being performed for the benefit of a local ruler who had assumed an Indic name, Mulavarman. For this to be happening in eastern Kalimantan, which is a remote place even today, signals the penetration of South Indian communities, not only merchants, but here also ritual officials, the priests of some sort, Brahmanical priests. So performing Vedic ritual, the stones are explicitly named as yupa, which is a Vedic sacrificial post, typically in wood. So a very, very important signal of the degree to which Indic ideas have penetrated the region by this time. You have from West Java the Purnavarman inscriptions of less than a century later, in which the king, Purnavarman, has identified himself with Lord Vishnu, the Vishnu Pada shown. The inscription is there eulogizing Vishnu, and then the rock itself has this great, what we call shell script, these great cursive scripts as well, which are largely talismanic, almost certainly protective, charms and spells, magical spells to provide protection. This is one of several rocks around in a river, deified river, a small fortified island, which may well have been the citadel of King Purnavarman. As another of his inscriptions found on what is today the harbour of Jakarta, Tanjung Priok, on the left, which records his commissioning of two canal systems for the benefit of brahmanas, communities of brahmana priests. Again, the role of intersection of Indic ideas here is very powerful. And the legacy of all that. Here is the early jewelry on the left being recovered from the Kutai area in Borneo, and on the right, a 1900s photograph of the then ruler of Kutai, wearing these ancient jewelry and the accoutrements of a Brahmanical ruler. Vishnu images of the region tell us a lot. On the left, you have an early Vishnu image from Andhra Pradesh, and on the right, one of the earliest coming out of Southeast Asia, which help us to understand the way in which styles evolved in the region. Here, three versions from the left from Peninsula Thailand, on the right from lower Funan, really, essentially, upper Mekong region, and on the right from Java. So you see here the evolution of the Vishnu types from the conch shell held on the hip through to it being raised above the head. The iconograph development takes place in the course of 4th to 6th centuries. And the intersection between these styles and those from India can be studied in detail. One of the most spectacular finds found a century ago was the 2-meter-high Vishnu from Takawapa and the Thai Peninsula on the Andaman Sea side, a site which clearly was a major Indic settlement, and not only has this been found, it clearly would have been in a major shrine, of which no trace survives, but a second Vishnu was also discovered nearby another hill, and in the same district, indicating this was really a very large settlement. And although there's no trace of monuments, the sculptures survive. And what's important here is that archaeological investigations in the 1950s, the University of Malaya identified traces of processed gold in the soil in this general vicinity. So again, supports the idea that there was an Indian community involved in the sourcing and processing of gold in this region. Here is the sculptures as they were discovered embedded in tree growth and then liberated, and now in the Phuket Museum. And we have both the great image of Vishnu, again over 2 meters in height, and the kneeling Rishi seen below is seen here, and again on the left-hand screen. This is almost certainly the Rishi Marandreya, as seen at Mahabalipuram. We see the figures kneeling in this very similar manner at Mahabalipuram. This idea convention gets repeated in the Thai Peninsula. The sources of the Peninsula Vishnus are not difficult to trace. Pallava, South India, 8th, early 9th century. On the right is a direct prototype for these images. Of course, large stone images can't travel, but of course small bronze versions can. And it's undoubtedly small, portable metal icons, and must have been one of the principal means of transmitting these particular styles. We can look for other prototypes as well. The beautiful early bronze Buddha on the right from central Java, this very attenuated manner, and the attenuated figure, which we recognize as early Javanese. It has resonances in Sri Lanka, and both of which point back to Andhra Pradesh, the so-called Amaravati style of Andhra Desa. Source for this, you can see the careful treatment of the folds, of the fluting of the robes, gathering at the ankles. All of this drawn across one shoulder. This very much follows Andhra conventions. This gets repeated later in the great Dongwon Buddha from central Vietnam, from monastery established under royal patronage in the mid-9th century. The consensus now of this object is that it was almost certainly made in Sri Lanka. So if that would be true, then we're witnessing here a large-scale commercial enterprise in highly expensive, what we could call these $1 million objects. These are very, very highly prized religious images commissioned in Sri Lanka and other places for circulation in the Buddha's diaspora. And the merchant system would have been part of that process. There are a multiplicity of sites, there are a multiplicity of religious affiliations. Here near Suratani, on a hillock, is a Lingavadi, a platform for Hindu Shiva Linga, and part of a whole network of chapels along a hill ridge. So Brahmanical activity was widely practiced, not just Buddhist. One of the key sites in these connections is Kedah, close to you in Singapore, just across the waters, in fact, from Pulau Penang. And Kedah is almost certainly the Arabic Kala, which features so prominently in first millennium navigational sources. Excavations there showed and remain today extensive brick foundations of temple structures, Buddhist and Hindu. And the associated archaeology of the sites has produced a profile of objects, ceramics, glass, metalwork, and so on, which mirrors the cargo of the Balatung cargo shipwreck, known to all of you. So Kala was clearly part of a trading system fed by vessels like the Balatung Tung ship. The site has yielded important inscriptions, two very important Buddhist, what I'd call Thanksgiving votive stelae, which were erected to, I think, express thanks to for safe passage. And the famous Buddha Gupta one, which on the screen now, the mariner, almost certainly from Bengal, and a recent find of a gold seal below, which again refers to the ship's captain as being a part of this enterprise. So, and of course, we know that there were missionaries, Buddhist philosophers, teachers circulating as well. A whole series of very important key figures in the dissemination of Buddhism to China. Atisha was in Sumatra for a period before he returned to India and ended up in Tibet. Vajrabodhi, of course, went to China. Amagaravajra also installed in that temple on the right, just for novelty. These people all circulated. Yijing, in his travels, went from Guangdong to Palembang and then went to Kedah. Why to Kedah? Clearly there were important monasteries. He tells us he stayed in Southeast Asia for nearly 2 years to study Sanskrit before going on to India. And this second one of these, remarkable, following closely South Indian prototypes. Images found in Kedah in the Lembar Bujang in the Bujang Valley. In Perak, this extraordinary image of Omega Pasha, form of Avalokiteshvara, washed out of the hillside in tin mining and operations in the 1930s. They almost certainly must have washed away the foundations of a major monastery. This is the type of place that Yu Jing and other Chinese pilgrims must have studied at in the 8th century. Upon the spread cloth, this is a quote from an inscription from Barus in North Sumatra, shown here, which records the presence of key South Indian merchant guilds, trade organizations, trading widely in the region, and the ships they used are recorded in South Indian mural paintings of the post-Vijayanagar period. And Nagapattinam was one of the key dissemination points for these communities. Moving on to Nagapattinam and its importance, particularly in the Chola period, and it's in this window of the 12th and 13th centuries that Nagapattinam and South China under the Mongols, when they elevated Chuangzhou to be their premier South China port in preference, or certainly heavily competing with Guangzhou and Canton. So we have very important evidence of royal patronage of at least 3 new monasteries in the course of the 11th century in Nagapattinam, Buddhist viharas, 2 under Chola patronage, 1 seemingly under the patronage of a ruler of Srivijaya. And this is the point of time after the Cholas themselves had raided Srivijaya more than once to assert their authority over the trade system. So this particular bronze on the screen almost tells us that it was commissioned in the reign of Rajendra, almost certainly Rajendra I, 1014 to 44. It's contemporary with the large Leiden coppergram, which records the founding of one of these new viharas by Raja Chola. It also tells us that it was commissioned by the Guild of Metal Workers. Metal workers is a very broad term. It can be from bronze casters to goldsmiths, but a significant one of the guild organizations, in other words, contributing these bronzes. And we have another bronze recovered from Sumatra, a triad, Lokeshvara triad, with an inscription very close in date. This is dated to 1039, so only less than 30 years after the Nagapattinam bronze I just showed you, named by an individual named Surya, and identifies himself as a metal worker. So again, the role of these trade guilds in craft guild organizations is very, very important, demonstrated by these inscriptions. Nagapattinam is famous for its so-called Chinese pagoda, which was visible to navigators on the coast, well recorded from the 17th century, and likely what's referred to in Chola period sources. We can't be totally sure of that. So many bronzes, 200 to 300 bronzes have been recovered. The most recent hoard, I think, found in 2004. Going back to the mid-19th century when these towers were torn down and a major cache was recovered. And the stunning quality, and of course one of the things about these bronzes is their portability. Not only portable for possessions and what they're made for, but also their ability to travel. And they traveled widely. Just during the Chola period, if we look at these 3 architectural elements, they tell us an enormous amount. Upper left, a capital fragment from an otherwise unidentified site in Nakhon-Si Thammarat in the Thai Peninsula. On the right, a balustrade lion-faced architectural element, stairizer element from Kedah, from the Pujang Valley, and on the lower left, a capital element from Chuangzhou, from one of the Hindu temples in the city, all around the 12th, 13th century. So these plot the presence of long-lasting communities of Tamils, people with clear South Indian affiliations. The architectural orders that are represented here are unambiguous. They belong to a Chola tradition. So finally, I want to come to Chuangzhou and the maritime traditions of Chuangzhou. And the final chapter of the story, which is centered on the city of Chuangzhou, famous as the city of the Twin Pagodas, which I show you one on the screen. Built in the Song dynasty, very, very important structures. Chuangzhou was important. It's referred to by Marco Polo, it's referred to by Ibn Battuta, and was a center that the Mongols actively promoted for international trade and cultivated particularly West Asians to hold key posts of authority in the commercial activities. In 1973, a Southern Song era shipwreck was discovered in the estuary of the harbour. You see the excavation taking place here. A large Chinese vessel with bulkheads on its return journey from Southeast Asia. Embedded in the vessel were traces of pepper and aromatic woods. So it was classic cargo for the Southeast Asian trade to China. It signals the importance of this long-distance trade. Muslim communities there were very, very important, encouraged, I'd say, under the Mongols especially. But of course, the maritime connections are also very, very important with the role of Persians, Arabs, Indian Muslims and others actively involved in this trade. After the 15th century, Indonesian, Malay Muslims also. Hindu temples at Chuangzhou, I think there are at least 2, have gone. There's no trace. The building materials were buried or recycled in various forms, but the mosques survived because the simple reason that Islam was taken up by many the population, and this, of course, gave life to the monuments as living places of worship. With the very beautiful the mihrabs facing Mecca and so on. It brings us finally to the great temple, the Kayuan, the great temple in Chuangzhou, which, as we see it today, is a 15th century Ming renovation. And this is a handsome but fairly standard southern China Buddhist temple. But what's remarkable, it has embedded in it recycled building materials from Hindu temples. Around the basement, this frieze of mythical Yali creatures, hybrid creatures we recognize from Nagapattinam, from Sri Lanka. It's a shared tradition, and these faceted pillars with their base midsection and capital details. Together we have an inscription, largely in Tamil, but with a gloss in online gloss in Chinese, dated to 1281 April, dedicated to Shiva. The patron is named as a Tamilian name. And it's very clear that this was the Tamil community building a Shiva temple for their own use, for their resident community, and of course the mobile community that came every year on the ships. We know from Malacca, Tomé Perez, as the population of Malacca expanded exponentially when the ships arrived each year. The core population itself was probably quite small. So here we have these two surviving pillars, which were recycled from the demolished Hindu temple, integrated into the Chinese temple, and decorate. The architectural order is clearly Chola, and the decorations here, we have an ascetic Shiva, and we can trace many of the motifs directly back to South India. A series of panels which were not integrated into the temple. These were panels, a whole lot of building sections with carved reliefs which disappeared, and then with the demolition of the Ming period city wall of Chuangzhou, when that wall was demolished in the 1940s for urban expansion or whatever, these building stones were discovered as filler in the core of the wall, and remarkable. So we have, for example, a famous South Indian theme of the elephant worshipping the linga, offering, illustrating it with water each day from his trunk, brought from the river, and so on. This is this Gendra legend that appears in Pallava sculptures I show on the right from Tiruvenkattu. These themes have been very popular. They still persist today. You see it in modern paintings of the same temple that has the Pallava panel I showed a moment ago. The cow illustrating the linga, legends associated with the Shiva saint Durabula, and again directly associated with temples in Kumbakonam and Pudukottai districts. So it's as if we can begin to localize where these stories come from that appear in Chuangzhou, and this may well be a clue to the origins of the communities who were based there, where they came from. Their communities were in South India and in Tamil Nadu. Images of Shiva performing the great dance, the Andana Tavana in the Telai forest at Chidambaram. Extraordinary, but you can see the treatment of the temple is imagined. It's a Chinese imagination of what an Indian temple might have looked like, based on no reality. Here, the same subject would be here in the Nakshi temple and elsewhere. Ali represented here, very familiar subject to many of you, and here appropriated and put back into worship in a small wayside shrine in a village on the southern outskirts of Chuangzhou, where she's worshipped as a Buddhist protectress. So we have this appropriation of the legacy absorbed back into the Chinese system. Chandra Moksha, the elephant seeking liberation from Vishnu, from crocodile, images of Krishna, again and again, wrestlers, which is a popular theme in South Indian temple decor, seen at Darasaram and other places. And on the right, a medallion, which is purely Chinese. It looks like a Chinese mirror, and it's quite clear. There's no time now to discuss in detail, but the workmanship on all of these is very Sinicized. It's clearly Chinese stonemasons working under direction of a Brahmin who's orchestrate all of this program. So where does this leave us? We have a clear evidence of extensive contact sustained through more than a millennium between South India and South China, and the story's not over yet. New shipwrecks being discovered on a regular basis. This is the Panong Seren shipwreck, the Gulf of Thailand, still being worked on, in which we have clear evidence of long-distance traders, not only operating the long-distance routes, India to China, but making ports of call for regional centers. This wreck was almost certainly serving Nakhon Pathom and through the river systems Hutong. So regional nodal areas, interregional trade, local trade, and the vessel contained a whole series of torpedo jars, West Asian type ceramics, one of which has a Pahlavi inscription telling us that these were included Iranian merchants, such as we see represented in this region in the stucco below from Kubwa in the 8th century. So this is very clear evidence of the complexity of this long-distance trading system. And here's one of the jars I mentioned, and they're not dissimilar to what's represented on the deck of the Ajanta ship of our sandalwood trader, Perna. From the Java Sea shipwrecks, a whole large quantities of bronze temple lamps of various types, very much South Indian in style, clearly coming long-distance trade. Suggests these are not made in Indonesia, these were certainly being made in South India and traded to supply the expanding temple systems of Western Indonesia. And of course, religious texts, accoutrements of ritual. This is also carved conch shell for libation, also from one of the Java Sea wrecks, from the Cirebon shipwreck, clearly witnessing the circulation of religious imagery, religious accoutrements, alongside an extensive trading system that linked the Indian Ocean world through trade. And central to this, the role of South Indian merchants. Thank you.
Too very often, thank you, Dr. Guy. Thank you. Too very often we forget that we actually sit smack at the center of a point of confluence between two great civilizations. And, it was very generous of you to have shared the images of so many artifacts that actually played a movie as if it were. It was as if you just unveiled a maritime Silk Route, for lack of better expression. Thank you, Dr. Guy. At this point, may I just remind the participants, if you have any questions, please send them in so that we can pose this question to Dr. Guy. Arun, may I now invite you to engage Dr. Guy on his presentation. I am sure you will agree with me, it has been absolutely breathtaking.
Indeed, I was thinking of the same word. It was not only fascinating, but visually so stimulating. Dr. Guy, I'm so glad that you started off this presentation mentioning Professor Wang Wu. We have something in common. He was also my teacher and mentor. And he just celebrated his 90th birthday. I'm sure you know that. And we are all praying that he will live for many, many more years to share his wisdom and erudition. But that prompted the question, because I've read a lot of Professor Wang's writings. He almost never uses any visuals. On the other hand, practically every point you made is based on a visual. Is it that curators cannot tell a story without artifacts?
Well, it's a very good point. And I think much of my professional life has been devoted to an historical corrective. People have myopically focused on texts. And whilst not for a moment to diminish the primacy of texts, they remain at the core of all scholarship. There is another parallel story, and particularly when you're looking at a region like Southeast Asia, early Southeast Asia, which is has such a paucity of textual sources, such a limited amount of sources, almost no manuscripts, very small number of inscriptions, and so on. You're left with an enormous lacuna. There's a great gap in our knowledge. And I would argue that we can break through that in knowledge through using the visual evidence. If you learn to read objects, learn to read artifacts as historical documents, as well as things of aesthetic interest, then I think we can and bring that in parallel to textual studies. I think we can move the field forward. So this, in a sense, is my mission, and if I demonstrate that this evening.
Yes, thank you. It was wonderful. Now, going on to some of the evidence that you brought forward, there was a wonderful scroll, 16th century is called Reproduced, and there was an emissary from Lanka. Now, he was the only one you pointed out among the whole lot of other Chinese. Now, why was it that he alone was picked up? There were a lot of Persian, even Malays and all, other ethnicities, other nationalities present at the time. What distinguishes this particular gentleman?
Okay, that's a very good question. Of course, the painting is 6th century, Liang dynasty, and it represents a particular moment. And at that moment, we can only assume, in the Chinese perception of the Nanhai, of the southern realm, their understanding was most of this was second-hand knowledge, gathered from Malay sailors and others. Not so much from direct experience, although undoubtedly there was direct Chinese contact. Lanka was one of the mid-perception at that time was the key, represented Southeast Asia. This was the key center. We know that Lanka had close links with Funan, and he would have been conquered by Funan sometime later. But at this point in time, this was one of the key centers. And of course, it's right bang on the, if you're sailing off the southern tip of Vietnam, that's where you land on the peninsula, and a source of where very important natural products could be gathered for trade, so I think that's the simple explanation. Yes, I think there dozen or so emissaries that are represented. All the others represent West Asian connections, overland Silk Route connections. This is the only one from the maritime world.
Thank you. Now, I'm just going to ask one last question before we turn it over to our audience. There are two interrelated points. Even though Buddhism and Hinduism from India, from Southeast Asia, South India, Jainism doesn't seem to have any impact at all in East Asia or in Southeast Asia.
Jainism.
Likewise, in terms of the Hindu religion, you have Vishnu worshipped and Vishnu celebrated in some parts, but to a lesser extent, it seems to me to a lesser extent, we also see Shiva. Now, is there any explanation why Vishnu is favored in some time or some spaces, and why Jainism has not appeared in this part of the world?
Again, a very insightful question. The issue of the presence of Jains is something of a mystery. I didn't show an image. I edited out because of length, which shows it's a palm leaf manuscript, a Jain palm leaf manuscript from Patan, which shows Jain merchants active in ships being sailed by people with beards. So I would tend to think they were Muslim. So it would suggest that the Jains were active in trade, which we know they were. They're a great trading community, and dictated partly by their religion and social constraints. And they were able to, they would use the facilities of the Red Sea traders and the Gujarati Muslim traders and so on. But there's, although some people have suggested otherwise, I see no compelling evidence that Jainism was evangelized in Southeast Asia. And if the attempts were made, there's no trace of it, and archaeologically at least. So that remains a mystery. The issue of Shaivism versus Vaishnavism. And this, I think, is a linear thing that changes through time. The earliest evidence, the earliest inscriptions are persistently, they're either non-affiliated, like the Rule of Arman from Kutai is essentially Vedic. And then you get this whole series of very important Vaishnava inscriptions and a whole series of Vishnu images, very powerful. And that seems to predominate. This is the Vishnu, Ram, this is the whole moral kingship, good dharma, powerful, compelling role model for local rulers trying to find a new way to bring their communities into something more advanced than into some sense of quality entity. And so Indian ideas seem to provide a model for this, a framework in which they could operate, and the concepts of kingship are very appealing, and the role model was Vishnu. What you see when you move into the second half of the first millennium is Shiva reasserting himself. So even in Champa in Vietnam, the Buddhist rulers will have dedicatory inscriptions which celebrate Lokeshvara and then acknowledge the overarching authority of Lord Shiva. So you have this sort of what sometimes I've called Shiva's land. That Shiva's authority extends over this whole region, and it is always must be acknowledged. And the whole series of inscriptions, the Devanika inscription in Champasak in southern Laos is a classic example of this, in which the Linga Pavata, the sacred mountain, is celebrated, acknowledging Shiva's overlordship to the domains. And they didn't conceive of themselves as colonies, they saw themselves as part of the greater Indic conceptual world, this religious world. And it was just another Tirtha, another holy place. So it's the inscriptions can tell us a lot by trying to read the history into beyond the core facts of the inscription. So I think the first half of the first millennium, heavily Vaishnava, the second half, Vaishnavism remains, but you see this reassertion of Shaivism as well, running in tandem.
In today's talk, as well as in many of your other writings, you have emphasized the role of Brahmins. Now, is it also the case that some Brahmins were Vaishnavites and some Brahmins were Saivites? And is it also the case that even among the trading communities, there were Vaishnavite communities and Saivite communities, and that had an influence on this part of the world?
We can only really speculate on that, but the assumption would be yes to that question, that both were present and both left their legacy in different ways. You have, of course, the courts of the royal courts of Phnom Penh and Bangkok still maintain Brahmins within the royal circle to provide ritual service, particularly for coronations and plowing ceremonies and so on and so forth. So I mean, in kingdoms in which the ruler is sworn to defend Buddhism, uphold the values of Buddhism, but they're part of the apparatus to support that concept of kingship is a Brahmanical structure underpinning it. I mean, this is a very, very interesting hybridity that's evolved that we see in mainland Southeast Asia.
That's like in the Thai coronation, they were still citing Tiruvasagam and Tirupavai, which are actually, Tamil, of Tamil origin. Okay, now I think I should let our audience, have a chance to chat with you. So I'll hand us over to Ali, who is going to channel the questions.
Thank you very much. I will steal the first opportunity. I have a question of my own. I guess one cannot but wonder if there's still a small lost tribe in China, you know, that originated from India. Did people, did traders, as they did in this part of the world, did they take up, you know, residency in China? It would be wonderful discovery if we find that community today, wouldn't it?
Right. Well, I mean, best to my knowledge, and I'll have to defer to Chinese anthropologists for that answer. I mean, of course, we do know about the integration of Tamils in Sumatra, in the Minangkabau, in the interior areas, and which no doubt a legacy of the Burrells community from that inscription from the 11th century. Many settled and intermarried, and there are people of Tamil descent. A lot of Tamil loan words appearing in various Sumatran languages, particularly Minangkabau. So this is, we see it in Sumatra very strongly, the Tamil legacy. And this is medieval as opposed to 19th century indented labor, whatever one calls it. So it's a different phenomenon. We know that there was the coming of Islam to South China left an important legacy with a Muslim minority. We have no trace, to my knowledge, of any legacy of the Hindu world, or indeed what I call the Indian Buddhist world. That seems to have not taken, well, certainly the Hindu legacy, not taken root. The temples that we know were there were temples also in Guangdong, referred to repeatedly in reliable sources. We have mosques remaining. We have no physical trace of the Brahmanical places of worship from the medieval period. These presumably were abandoned, building materials recycled, as we've witnessed in Chuangzhou, and being urban centres simply built over. So no traces remain.
We have a question from no other than Professor John Mexick. I'll read the question. He asks, we read about traveling goldsmith in early Indian literature. How much is historically known about the mobility of artisans and artists in early India, such as goldsmith, painters, sculptors, or glass workers? Were they free to travel, unlike their counterparts in feudal Europe? Would the travel of Indian artisans to Southeast Asia have been common or rare? Who would have brought them to Southeast Asia? That's a question from Professor John Mexick.
Thank you for that question, John. I think the circulation of artisans is important, and I think the key to it would be the presence, which we know about from a whole series of inscriptions from Pagoda, from Burrells and elsewhere, the presence of Indian merchant guilds. And I think the guilds would be the key to this. They would recruit, finance, they would have in their entourage not only mercenaries who would guard the go-downs and the goods in their communities, operating in foreign places, but also they would have employ specialist craftspeople to work in the gold and the metalworking, and people who have specialist knowledge to do quality control on the gathering of resins and forest products and so on. These are special skills, special knowledge, like the story of Purna in the Buddhist legends. You know, he was an adopted son of a sandalwood merchant, and from a site near Bombay, and made his fortune because of his connoisseurship of sandalwood. He could identify the highest grade qualities, made his fortune. So the people with these skills would be employed. It needs someone like Purna in Southeast Asia to choose the best aromatics, ascended try to burn in the temples as offerings. All of this. So I think the key to the circulation of skills, artisan skills, is the role of the organizing capacity of the guilds, the merchant organizations. I doubt if they travel, an individual weaver or an individual goldsmith, unlikely to pay his passage and travel independently to the peninsula.
I must say that we have comments. It's rife with compliments for the presentation today. We really have to thank you, Dr. Guy, for making this a wonderful session. I have one question here from one Silva Kumar. He says, thank you for the excellent presentation. Most of the stone images of the Hindu temples were perhaps carved locally in Southeast Asia. Are there instances where the images were actually carved in India and then taken to Southeast Asia? If so, is there any evidence for that?
That's a very moot point. We have clear evidence of Satavahana and Isvaku sculptures from Andhra Pradesh in Sri Lanka, for example. Small panels which clearly Andhra limestone being imported and no doubt used as models for Anuradhapura Buddha sculpture. We have bronzes, the great Kedar, 8-armed Lapechvara that I showed, washed out the hillside, tin mining operations in the 1930s, that one, 1 meter high bronze. No one knows where it was made. I put my money on that being an import from India, of which we have no surviving examples in metal in India. We have stone versions from Nalanda and elsewhere, but no metal ones, they've all perished. But this survived in Perak, so remarkable. And then, of course, and I think it's the portability of small bronze images, and no doubt sandalwood and other materials, the auspicious materials that were the prototypes for models for many artists. But what's also clear is, although these initial waves of contact came, these were very quickly localized, and this was simply the stepping off point for a whole process of innovation, so that the Vishnus of 6th century Thailand could never be mistaken for an Indian sculpture of that period. They've already moved on their own trajectory and their own stylistic preoccupations, very different. So it's very clear that the style takes multiple paths of evolution.
Okay, well, we have about 20 questions, but we don't have time to take all those questions. We will take 2 more questions. There's a very interesting question from Paul Chan. Was the diplomat from Lanka Sukha to the Liang dynasty court? Could he possibly be a Tamil?
I didn't catch the beginning of that.
Was the diplomat from Lanka Sukha to Liang dynasty, was he possibly a Tamil?
Oh, well, we can only speculate. Who was travelling that? We don't know, of course. We know that the Malays were already actively going to southern China at that time, along with southern Indians. So both are there. It depends on the power system. The emissary would be almost be the same ethnicity, very likely, as the ruler of Lanka Sukha. Could be an extended member of the royal family, local royal family, and so on. We simply don't know.
So this will probably be the final question for this evening. The inscription in Tamil dating to 1281, which exact location was it located at or discovered? What would the period of Shiva worship be in the city of Chuangzhou?
Okay, so most of the material that I showed from Chuangzhou, including the inscription, came out of the Ming period city wall when it was demolished in the 20th century. When that wall was torn down for urban expansion or whatever, many of these stones, 50 or 60 of these stones, were recovered and identified as being of some historic interest by a local school teacher, and thank goodness put in the grounds of the temple, actually. So there was no museum, somewhere to keep them safe. So we have no find spot, no archaeological find spot. So the temple itself from which this inscription came was undoubtedly embedded in the fabric of the wall of the temple originally. Is long lost. We can assume, I think, reasonably that the remains of the temple, probably no longer in use, were standing up until the 15th century. At that point, they said, oh, very convenient building materials, took those stones, used them as filler for the core of the wall, and there they remained until the 20th century. And the site, of course, would have been built over with urban expansion in the 15th century, and so untraceable unless you demolish. But we do know that land was, we have 13th century sources and earlier that tell us that land was bought with funding from merchants, Indian merchants, to fund viharas and temples. Chautakwang, the 13th century Chinese commentator, harbour master, confirms this. And they consistently refer to South Chuangzhou, near one of the very famous gates of the city. And these are the areas closest to the river. So this is probably where the go-downs were. This is probably the quarters where the foreigners lived, including the Tamils. They tended to be quarantined away from the core of the city, and I think they chose to be close to the water in case they had to make a hasty retreat by sea for security. And there are moments in the history of the region when that was a very real concern, with civil unrest in China. So the answer to the question is almost certainly the temples were in the southern part of the city, abutting the river. But archaeologically, we no prospect of finding that.
Well, it leaves me to thank you, Dr. Guy, for so generously sharing with us years of collections and years of work. Thank you so much. It made a lot of difference to many of us because to be totally honest about it, this is something new. It is it is a revelation of a sort, you know. Thank you. And I think we had a very, very interesting, insightful session today. And that would not have been possible without the images of artifacts that you shared and the answers that you had for many of our questions. Thank you. Then now it leaves me to invite Nalina Gopal, the curator of the Indian Heritage Center, to share with us the closing remarks. Nalina.
Thank you, Ali. Before I share my concluding remarks, I just wanted to get in on that question that Mr. Arun had for Dr. Guy about could a curator speak without sharing images? And I think
I guess you're the proof.
I think now is a very timely opportunity for us to speak about this, because during the pandemic, many of us are really wondering about how museums are going to go forward with international collaborations, considering the excessive costs of logistics, even just museums being in different stages of lockdown and collections moving around. And I really wanted to put forth a proposal to Dr. Guy, opportunist that I am, to suggest that perhaps, having seen this wonderful webinar that you offered us as a visual treat, perhaps it's time for us to consider collaborating on a digital exhibition to bring together images from the region, through your unique lens, and really to see if the two institutions could collaborate and make, the digital platform the space that the curator speaks with visuals, and does so in a way that is beyond the limitations that physical spaces offer us most often. And with that, firstly, I would like to extend my personal gratitude to Dr. John Guy for accepting our invitation to speak in this webinar series. I'm particularly glad he accepted our invitation, as due to scheduling conflicts, we were unable to collaborate with Dr. Guy for our publication. I'm glad we've been able to write that missed opportunity this evening, and my thanks to Suresh Kumar Muthukumaran for reminding Dr. Guy of this publication project when they were co-speakers at ACM's recent Maritime conference. It would be remiss of me if I didn't acknowledge the absolute inspiration the exhibition titled Lost Kingdoms, Hindu-Buddhist Sculpture of Early Southeast Asia, curated by Dr. John Guy, and the synonymous publication was to us at the center when working on our permanent and recent special exhibition on Tamil diasporas. Your work is very much appreciated in this part of the world, and we are only sorry that we were unable to welcome you at the center in person to hear from you. We look forward to doing so in the future. The port of Nagapattinam has such importance in the narrative of Tamil connections with Southeast Asia. Our recently concluded special exhibition From the Coromandel Coast to the Straits, Tamils in Revisiting Our Tamil Heritage, enumerated the odyssey of pre-modern Tamil diasporas in Southeast Asia, while part 2 of the exhibition offered glimpses of lesser-known 19th century pioneers and some of the oldest Tamil families in Singapore. In both halves of the exhibition, Nagapattinam featured as an important port of trade and migration activities. For instance, we were fortunate to be able to collaborate with the Leiden University Library to present a digital hologram of the larger Leiden grant. This copperplate grant contains an edict issued by the Chola king Rajaraja Chola in 1006 CE. It serves as the last primary evidence for the mention of Sri Vijaya and as a record of the cross-cultural relationship between Tamil and Southeast Asian polities. The Tamil plates, comprising 332 lines, state that the construction of a Buddhist complex had commenced at Nagapattinam under the aegis of the king of Kadaram or Kada, Mara Vijayatungavarman, in the name of his father, Chulamani Varman. The fact that this inscription was shown in the exhibition was an important reminder that Southeast Asia, at various points in history, was on equal footing in its relationship with counterparts in South India. From the 19th century onwards, Nagapattinam also served as an important port of migration. It is a port that several Tamil families recall their ancestors having sailed from on ships such as the SS Rajula. Furthermore, many families trace their roots to Nagapattinam, including our host for this evening, Ali. Hence, the title of tonight's webinar itself holds a poignant note for many joining us tonight. In the exhibition, we also acknowledged the maritime links between South India and Southeast Asia, dating back to the late prehistoric period. We reminded visitors that during this period, Tamils acted as intermediaries in a trade network comprising the Roman Empire and the Mediterranean in the west to the other side of the Bay of Bengal, and that by the early centuries of the Common Era, pre-modern Tamil diasporas comprising seafarers and traders traveling to ports in Southeast Asian polities had become common. But tonight, Dr. Guy has reminded us of the central role Southeast Asia was playing in the trade networks linking India and China, that Southeast Asia was an important source for many luxury goods supplied by Persian, Arab, and Indian traders is yet another point of importance. The role of Tamil merchants in South China ports is such an important part of the puzzle, a story that due to paucity of space we couldn't elaborate on in our exhibition. It was wonderful to be able to feature this narrative through tonight's webinar and take that wonderful journey from Nagapattinam to Chuangzhou with Dr. Guy. Sojourners to Settlers, Tamils in Southeast Asia and Singapore is to be published in Tamil, a first publication in Tamil for IHC and the Institute of Policy Studies. Leading up to its launch in April 2021 during the Tamil Language Festival, this webinar series aims to provide you glimpses of the publication's offerings and in tonight's case, what we missed featuring in the publication. We would like to thank once again Dr. John Guy for being so generous with his time and research and for agreeing to speak to us from New York at quite an early hour, especially because it's daylight savings there, something we didn't realize at the point that we fixed this lecture. And this Tamil publication and tonight's session would really not have been possible without the generous support of the Tamil Language Learning and Promotion Committee, Yuva Bharati International School, as well as the Tamil Language Council. Our sincere gratitude to them. We would also like to take this opportunity to thank Mr. Arun Maharnan for being such an able chair for this session and for his infinite dedication and passion championing Singapore's Tamil heritage. With that, thank you very much, and I'm over to you, Ali.
Thank you, Nalini. I guess that brings the session to a fitting finish. The next session will be held during the first Digital Tamil Language Festival in Tamil. Yes, it will be digital. And will feature Dr. Tawson Sarsha, research on Tamil Muslim diaspora. It is scheduled for the 28th of November 2020. It's just days away. And should you like to register for the session, please email us or stay tuned to our PayTix or Facebook pages. And I wish everyone a restful Sunday. Good night.